Genesis 22, 1-14 would have to be one of the most disturbing passages in the Bible. And on top of that, it's reasonably well known. So it's something that people outside the church have heard about and will point to and say, how could you trust a God who would do that? Well, how do you respond? How can we trust a God who would do that? It helps, of course, to know that God never intended for Isaac to be sacrificed. The reader is told at the beginning that this is a test. But even so, to put a father and son through so much trauma for the sake of a test, how can we trust a God who would do that? Well, when we feel uncomfortable about a Bible passage, we can either ignore it or we can take a deep breath and look at it more closely. And you guessed it, we're not going to ignore it. But I will say that there may be people listening and watching this video who at this point in your life should ignore it. There'll be another time to deal with it. Say, someone who's experienced violence in their own childhood might find it overwhelming to take a close look at this passage. And if you need to just switch off and go and do something else, that is perfectly okay. And if you need to talk to someone, please do that. And if you have no one, please talk to me. But if you are ready, then take a deep breath and let's have a closer look. And because, as I look at this passage, I have questions. I want to know what Isaac was thinking. When did he realize what was going on, and did he resist? We're not told how old he was when he carried the wood, but we're not told how old he was, but we are told that he carried the wood. So he can't have been a toddler. It looks like he was probably a teenager, or what we would call a teenager. Now, what did this do to his relationship with his father? There's no further mention in Genesis of them doing anything together, which may or may not mean anything, but we do need to ask the question, was their relationship irreparably fractured by this experience? Is there something going on here at an archetypal level about the need for a change in the parent-child relationship, maybe a dramatic change, in order for the child to move beyond being a sign of God's blessing to the parents to being an agent of blessing for the world, which is what the children in this family are called to be? And so I wonder about Isaac, but I also wonder about Sarah. She was clearly not told what Abraham was going to do, but did she find out later? Did Abraham tell her? Did Isaac tell her? I think we can guess how she would have reacted. Pretty much as any mother would react, only maybe more so because she had waited so long for this, her only child. And then I wonder about Abraham as well. I sense a weariness in him here. He is flat and passive. He just does as he's told without any reaction or objection. Now, this is sometimes read as a sign of simple faith, but I wonder about that. Because this is a man who had a stand-up argument with God in chapter 18 over the destruction of a city where his nephew lived, and here is his own son in danger, and he says nothing. You'll remember from last week that Abraham has already sacrificed one son, Ishmael, and I wonder how much that was weighing on him here. God says, take your son, your only son, Isaac, the son you love. Ouch. Isaac isn't his only son. Ishmael is also his son. But he has sacrificed Ishmael. So even though Ishmael is still alive, no thanks to him, Abraham has no right to consider himself Ishmael's father anymore. I wonder if Abraham needed this reenactment as a sort of gestalt therapy to make him face up to what he did to Ishmael and to Hagar. Or perhaps he blamed God for the loss of Ishmael, so that when God asked him to sacrifice Isaac too, he thought, well, yeah, I guess this is the sort of thing God does. And so maybe this horrifically dramatic lesson was what it took for him and his descendants to get the message that no, this is not the sort of thing God does. And here we get to the heart of the problem I have with this passage. Abraham's actions here are held up as an example of faith. But what we see here does not look like faith to me. It looks more like resigned passivity toward a hard, demanding God. And belief that God is hard and demanding, well, that's not faith. But still, I wonder if any of you so worn down by one thing after another that when you see the next challenge rolling down the hill towards you, you just think, oh, really, God? Another thing? Well, okay then, do your worst. I think we've all been there at some time. But is that faith? Surely a person of faith in Abraham's place would have said, no, God, you are not like that. Maybe all those other supposed gods demand child sacrifice, but not you. You are different. If I have left everything to follow a God who is just as violent and bloodthirsty as all the others, then what am I even doing here? That's what I think he should have said. But then he probably grew up with religions that practice child sacrifice. So maybe for him the idea was not as unthinkable as it is for us. And how could he be expected to know better? All he knew was that God had called him and made promises to him. That's it. He didn't have Jesus, he didn't have the law or the temple or the Psalms or the prophets. How could he know that God was so completely different from the gods his family had worshipped? Well, he was about to learn. This shocking event will sear that truth onto his mind and the minds of his descendants. This story, put it in giant letters, God does not want human sacrifice. Don't do it. God does not condone violence towards children, ever. God did not want Isaac to be sacrificed, nor Ishmael, nor any child. And it would take his descendants a long time to fully get that point. You might recall, if you've read the book of Judges, the horrific story of Jephthah, who decided for no good reason that God wanted him to sacrifice his daughter. Well, that was several centuries down the track from Abraham, so you might think, surely these people have learned from this. And they have, but even so, somehow, it was not yet unthinkable, even then. God was calling these people out of a religious environment in which it was understood that gods need humans to satisfy their needs, and that gods actually got hungry and needed to be fed on sacrifices, including human sacrifices. Abraham was called out of that way of relating to the gods and into a relationship with the God who has no needs. A God who wants nothing but a trusting relationship and to see creation flourishing. There is one point in this story when Abraham stops acting like an automaton and starts taking some initiative. After God stops him from sacrificing Isaac, Abraham looks up. Looking up is a sign that he is coming out of his depressed state. He looks up and he sees a ram with its thorns caught in a thicket, and he decides to sacrifice that instead of Isaac. About 100 years ago, archaeologists digging in a burial site in Ur, where Abraham is said to have come from, found 2 statues of rams, or maybe goats, with foliage around their heads. Now, the connection may be tenuous, so this is just a possibility, but maybe this was a well-known religious image from the world that Abraham grew up in. And maybe by sacrificing that ram, he is symbolically throwing the ideas about God he had grown up with onto the fire. Perhaps it took a harrowing story like this one to begin to change Abraham's family's minds about God. Isaac may or may not have ever forgiven his father, but he would never forget the day God said a dramatic no to child sacrifice. And neither would his descendants, even down to today. To be honest, if I were God, I think I'd have tried to find another way to make this point. Maybe one that did not bring so much trauma into the relationship between a father and a son. But perhaps such a vital lesson needed to be shocking in order to be memorable. For centuries, preachers have applied this story to congregations by asking, "Are you willing to sacrifice the thing you love most for God?" I think that's the wrong question, because clearly God did not want Isaac to be sacrificed. Now, as we've been looking at the book of Genesis, I've been telling you that it is written in cycles, and you need to refer back to the first few chapters to understand the later ones. I think this story refers back to Adam and Eve eating the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, this was a lack of trust that God had their best interests at heart. Eating that fruit meant they believed they had found a better way to fulfill their destiny than the one God had provided. Abraham has repeated their mistake over and over, looking for shortcuts rather than trusting God to do what God has promised. But at last, he had the son God had promised, and through whom God's promises would be fulfilled. Something like the tree of life. Had he now learned to trust? Would he trust God with Isaac's future? Would he let go of his need to control his family and let God do God's work? The answer, as we have seen, is yes and no. He obeyed God and is commended for that. But did he for a moment believe that the God who had called him would really want child sacrifice? If he thought that even for a moment, then he really didn't know God at all. He may have taken a step toward a trusting relationship with God, but it's just a tiny baby step. And Well, as we consider the whole history of God's relationships, God's relationship with humanity, a tiny baby step is still worth celebrating as progress. When we read Genesis, we need to look back to the beginning, and we also need to look forward to the rest of the history recorded in the Hebrew Scriptures. We don't know exactly when this book reached its final form, but let's imagine it was when the Jews were exiled in Babylon. That's quite possible. For them, it would have appeared that all was lost. Future were gone. Their land, their temple, their king. They would know exactly what it felt like to be Abraham, asked to sacrifice his hope for the future. They needed to hear again the assurance that God will provide, that there will be a future even when all seems lost. And then we jump right all the way ahead to where we are now. The church, in many places, is going through a bit of an exile period. We know, not completely, but a little bit, what it would have felt like to be those exiles in Babylon. We know, looking at all that has been lost over the last few decades, we have a sense for what it may have felt like to be Abraham, asked to let go of his son. We have lost numbers and influence and financial security. But do we really believe God needs those things? Can we face the loss of all those things and keep believing that God will provide? That there will be a future, even if it looks quite different from the present? Are we ready to walk away from beliefs that are unworthy of God, or practices that are holding us back from fulfilling our calling? But most importantly, do we still believe in a God who asks for human sacrifice? Maybe not literally, but do we ever think that God wants to make our lives hard? That God doesn't want things to go well for us? Or do we ever think that loving God more will require us to love people less? This story about Abraham and Isaac is so shocking that it sears its message into our brains. God does not have needs. God does not demand sacrifice. God is the God who provides, who gives, always. So, however hard things may be, however many things you may feel that you've had to let go of, may your eyes be lifted up this week to see God's great love and abundant provision. Amen.